Hello, I'm Jim Cornell, and this is Base to Base, the weekly biotech podcast from Air Coastal Media. Yes, welcome again to the Base to Base biotech podcast, and this is number 58, and it's going live on May the 8th. It was election day here in Scotland yesterday, and the rest of the UK as well, so the village was much busier than usual. There were 17 different parties on the ballot sheet. I didn't even know there were that many. I also got 2 flyers through the mailbox this morning from 2 of those parties. So they are either a little bit late or they're extremely early for the next one. Last week we had conversations with Life Inna about their cooling technologies and with Fundamental Pharma about treatment-resistant depression. This week it's a longer than usual interview about congenital myotonic dystrophy with disease advocate Lisa Harvey-Duren and Chief Scientific Officer and CEO of AMO Pharma, Michael Snape. If you do have news or suggestions for who should be on the podcast, or indeed any other comments or suggestions, please do get in touch at jim@deeptechdigest.com, which is also the address you can use if you're interested in advertising with us or sponsoring a podcast episode, or both, or for event coverage. First, it's time to go through some of the headlines of the articles you may not have read over at deeptechdigest.com. There was another holiday this week, and it's funny how just one day can adversely affect the news stream. The Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology identified viruses and variants simultaneously by controlling CRISPR speed. Scientists have discovered a new way to make drug-resistant cancer treatable, and it's been shown that mini-antibodies reactivate the p53 protein. A new first-in-class therapy for chronic graft-versus-host disease has been approved in Australia. There has been a priority review for a potential first approved treatment for warm immune hemolytic anemia, and Grey Wolf Therapeutics and Genomics are looking to develop first-in-class autoimmune disease treatments. New research is bringing personalised treatment for Parkinson's disease closer. Researchers have discovered new therapeutic targets for lithium in Alzheimer's disease, and lab-grown red blood cells can cover all blood types. And you can read all of these and plenty more at deeptechdigest.com. We are going with just the one interview this week because it's a little longer than usual, but it is with 2 people. And it's a discussion on congenital myotonic dystrophy, where we will hear not only about what the company AMO Pharma is doing, but also hear about it from the other side, with someone deeply affected by the devastation of the disease. So our guests are congenital myotonic dystrophy patient advocacy consultant Lisa Harvey-Duren, who was the founding Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation executive director in 2008, and also Michael Snape, CEO and Chief Scientific Officer of AMO Pharma, which is developing a treatment for the disease. All right, hello to you both, and thanks so much for taking the time to join us on the podcast today. Perhaps to start, we can get a bit of background on AMO Pharma.
AMO Pharma is a US-UK company. It's roughly 50-50 in terms of our staff. We're about 10 people, and we were founded in 2015 by a group of individuals who have sons, daughters, or grandsons affected by childhood onset rare neurological disorders, not myotonic dystrophy, it has to be said, but similar conditions. And most of us have worked in the pharmaceutical industry for some time, and so we were motivated to get together and see if we could do something to increase options in this area. We're a virtual company. We all work from home. It seems quite easy for us to do that. We operate on a global basis, and we are presently financed by a private equity group who have a a long-term view.
So I guess then we move on to the condition, and I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about congenital myotonic dystrophy.
Sure, I'd be happy to cover that. And thanks for having us. I guess it might be easier to explain what myotonic dystrophy is before I get into the congenital form of it. Myotonic dystrophy is known as DM, which is the Latin acronym for dystrophia myotonica. Myotonic dystrophy is an inherited disease, and it's a type of muscular dystrophy that frequently causes prolonged muscle contractions and muscle weakness, among many other progressive symptoms. It can hit at any age as well. Myotonic dystrophy is, caused by an expanded CTG repeat in the DNA that's translated into RNA, which then forms abnormal hairpin-like structures, which is basically just too much material. Extra CTG repeats are in that hairpin, and they cause problems with the proteins going through to do their normal body functions, and they get kind of stuck in what I call the goop. Myotonic dystrophy comes in two forms. You've got type 1 and type 2, also known as DM1 and DM2. Type 1 is the most common, and it's usually more severe than DM2. And DM1 is caused by an expanded DMPK gene on chromosome 19. I'm going to focus on DM1 for this conversation, as it's the only form that can pass down the congenital form of it. The congenital form in our community is known as CDM. The symptoms of myotonic dystrophy can vary a lot within the same family, including body systems affected, the severity of symptoms, and the age of onset. Typically, basically, the earlier the symptoms begin, the more severe it is. It's an autosomal dominant disorder, and it's passed down from one parent with a 50-50 chance of each child being affected. So it follows anticipation within each generation, meaning that every generation, the symptoms get more severe. And DM1 affects muscle weakness, a delayed relaxation of the muscle after a contraction, which is called myotonia, issues with the heart, lungs, eyes, gastrointestinal system, central nervous system, multiple brain issues, and skin and endocrine, and you name it, it's basically every body system. It's considered a multisystemic disorder, and within each of those systems, there are multiple symptoms. So it's very complex. Congenital myotonic dystrophy is the most severe form of myotonic dystrophy type 1, in which symptoms are present at birth. So congenital meaning present from birth. And it often requires immediate medical attention. A lot of babies with CDM often have low muscle tone and may have difficulty breathing or feeding on their own. And because symptoms began so early, infants with CDM often need specialized medical care right away. High-risk hospitals are usually the best place. Infants with CDM often need specialized medical care right away and are usually taken to the neonatal intensive care unit. CDM is also inherited typically from the mother who has DM1. The mother may not know that and always, be symptomatic at the time of the child's birth. So it can be very complex to diagnose because typically they'll come to see if the mother has any symptoms. And then if they don't, then it makes it a little bit more challenging to believe that it is this disease. That really delays a diagnosis. Sometimes it's very apparent that somebody has myotonic dystrophy, and that makes it a lot easier to diagnose a child if the parent is showing symptoms. And as children grow, symptoms and needs can change. So they start out with very complex medical issues, tracheostomies, sometimes, feeding tubes, lack of physical movement, low muscle tone. And some challenges do improve over time. And so it's strange where the adult form, once you start having symptoms, it just progresses downward. But with the congenital form, you can improve. And typically, the changes going back to, being progressive start kind of around the teen years. And so, it gives you years to build up their muscle and do what you can. So, most kids will need ongoing medical and educational and supportive care. So
I think that was an excellent description by Lisa. Now, I just want to echo a couple of the points that you made there. Principally, the complexity of the disorder. There is no single cardinal symptom for someone with myotonic dystrophy. It may be that for the congenital individuals, certain things are more common like perhaps some cognitive difficulties, autistic features, and so on. But it's not like if you want to do a clinical study in this condition, doing a study in high blood pressure where every patient has the same thing wrong with them, and therefore you just have to measure one thing. Selection of outcome measures in clinical studies is complex due to the complexity of the condition.
One of the things that I see often is once a child enters the hospital for one issue, it tends to snowball, and suddenly they're in for 5 different things when they just came in for one issue. And so I call it the snowball effect, where symptoms and things just keep happening because of the weakness and not being able to, get up and move. It's a really complicated disease in that respect. So you're just always kind of juggling different balls of symptoms and trying to keep ahead of everything. It's difficult as a parent.
Going kind of backwards a step from that, what are the problems with diagnosis with something like this?
The diagnostic odyssey for myotonic dystrophy 1, DM1, can sometimes take up to 10 years, as many of these symptoms get attributed to other problems. For instance, my mother had vertigo, according to her doctor, but, eventually she was diagnosed with DM. So you get a lot of people getting lots of different diagnoses along the way for symptoms, and then eventually somebody figures it out. Sometimes just from facial features. You walk into a doctor who's very experienced and they can just say, I know what you have. But babies with CDM usually get diagnosed in the first month or two, as symptoms are so severe. So there are some that still take a while to get a diagnosis, sometimes years, even in the congenital form. But, eventually as they encounter a doctor that sees the signs of DM, it's diagnosed.
Is there a possibility or the potential for AI to impact that in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that as AI progresses, I think it will be used, a tool will be used to be able to diagnose it, because there are very distinctive features, but some don't happen. Like for a child with congenital myotonic dystrophy who's very young, they don't have myotonia, which is the classical hand gripping issue. So people may not think it's that. But I think definitely AI in the future will definitely be helpful. Looking at testing at birth, if that does come through where that will be able to be done for all people, that is definitely something that will help in the end and help be able to counter the symptoms, ahead of time.
Obviously, Lisa, you have personal experience of this. I wonder if you could tell me about your family story related to this.
Yeah, my connection to myotonic dystrophy is both professional and deeply personal to me. I started planning a family in late 2003, just after I'd finished graduate school, and so excited to kind of get my family going. And after multiple miscarriages, I finally got pregnant again and was due in mid-September of 2005. Everything seemed to go well. Of course, it was my first pregnancy, and all the doctors told me, oh, don't worry, don't worry. Lots of things happen, but you're totally healthy. But in my 6 months of pregnancy, I started measuring much larger than normal. Eventually, I was diagnosed with polyhydramnios, which is just way too much amniotic fluid. Before I gave birth to Kayla, I had 4 times the amniotic fluid of a typical pregnancy. And that happens, I found later, in hindsight, looking back, I found that the child isn't breathing the amniotic fluid. That's how they, build their lungs up. And so it kind of backs up. But at the time, they just said, oh, you're fine, it can be anything. And so they didn't really make me worry. So I was really closely monitored and went into labor 4 times in that 6-month period at the 6th month. Every week I would go in Friday night for a fetal stress test, and they would keep me there for hours and hours while other moms were coming and going. So my labor would start. I didn't feel anything. And so they would stop labor and, send me home. Well, on the 5th time, I went in and they said that I was dilated. So they sent me to a high-risk hospital where I was put on bed rest for the next few months until I was ready to deliver Kayla. But to my surprise, within 24 hours, my water broke multiple times through the night, and I was told that they would be delivering my daughter that day due to lack of fetal movement. It was terrifying. Plus, I hadn't painted her room yet. As a parent, that's what you think about, and I didn't really truly understand at that moment the severity of it. I think they kind of kept that from me. So, I went in just excited to get my new daughter, knowing that she would be, born at 7 months, was going to be early and she would need some supportive care. But my daughter was born in an emergency C-section and was not breathing after delivery at all. When they pulled her out, they ran her by me and I could see that her arms were just limp. So they intubated her right there and they placed her on a ventilator, and then they rushed her to the neonatal intensive care unit. At that point, I was so grateful I was in a high-risk hospital. I was 39 at the time, so I was an older mom. Kayla was extremely hypotonic, and the doctors called it floppy baby syndrome, as she had almost no body tone. So we stayed in the NICU for almost 4 months, and she battled her life repeatedly. She had multiple infections. One time it was sepsis from different things, like they tried to place a central line and it became septic within a week, and she almost died. So we almost lost her multiple times during that time frame. At that point, we decided, they were testing her for lots of different things, and some of those came back negative. And eventually, Kayla was diagnosed with congenital myotonic dystrophy. She got her diagnosis at 46 days old, which is very fast. But for, when you're in that situation, it felt like a lifetime. But knowing what I know about this disease now, it was incredibly quick, and I'm grateful for that. So at that point, we decided to move towards a tracheostomy and a permanent feeding tube so that we could get her home. Winter was coming upon us at that point, and I just did not want to have her in the hospital, with things like RSV and other potential respiratory issues going on. So we brought her home with a full team of, nursing care. And one of the things the doctors warned us is that Kayla probably wouldn't live to see her first birthday, and she might not be able to walk or talk or eat by mouth. And so they painted a really grim picture of what this was going to be like. So we decided to fight and just work really hard to do the best we could for our daughter. So Kayla started to show improvements, and they were small improvements, not like a typical milestone. We were able to slowly wean down the nursing. So within, 6 months, we had, just one nurse, and then, we would do the rest of the care. Kayla had a different plan than her doctors, honestly. You could see her determination and her fight to beat the odds that she'd been given. We brought in multiple therapeutic interventions, such as physical and occupational therapy, sensory motor therapy, feeding therapy, speech therapy, and each of these things helped in different ways. Day by day, Kayla kept improving and kept proving her doctors wrong. One thing I decided to do with her was to do signing with her, because we weren't sure if her language would develop. So we figured by teaching her signs that she could still communicate with us. And that was an incredible experience, because Kayla did speak and she did walk and she did talk. All those milestones were delayed, but it was beautiful to watch this child develop and basically come from the grip of death to having such an incredible life. So she brought a sense of joy and determination and curiosity to life. She loved to read and was always eager to learn. And it was such a blessing. So Kayla grew up to be a beautiful young lady. She, lived a very, very active life. We have a great disability community where we live, Santa Cruz, California. And so she was able to surf and kayak and do all kinds of activities that you'd never imagine for a child that was so impacted. So sadly, Kayla's heart stopped in bed overnight when she was just 13 years old. We were just a month away from having an implantable defibrillator placed in her, and our hearts were shattered. But, my fight has continued in her honor, because I don't want all of her friends that I know that have congenital myotonic dystrophy to have to fight so hard in their life just to make it through another day. And so, I fight for her, and I fight for a lot of different kids. We've got a group of families together, and about 1,000 people in that group are direct caregivers.
So what else are you doing in that advocacy field now?
I became an advocate the day Kayla was born, really. And I feel like it was in my DNA to be an advocate. I grew up with two parents who were both working on fighting social justice issues and human rights. And so we grew up on Capitol Hill for our later years. And so I really got to see what it takes to advocate. And that was such a great example. I had no idea that I would be leaving my job as, I was a senior product manager for eBay, basically. And I left that job so that I could start fighting and working on this disease. Complete switch in careers, but it was amazing. So when Kayla was about 18 months old, I started working with other families and we created the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation. And within a year, I became the first executive director for the foundation in about 2008. And so that's where I began really advocating for families and gathering families up so that we could, build a community. And we have such a huge community at this point. It's incredible. We did things outside of the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation. We worked with the MDA, Muscular Dystrophy Association. Kayla was on the telethon starting at 1 year old. She didn't say anything at that point, but we went and told her story and shared it in Sacramento for about 4 years. And then she was invited to be a part of the national telethon in Las Vegas with Jerry Lewis. And that was quite an experience. She was also an Easter Seals ambassador. So we were speaking with, at lots of Easter Seals dinners and fundraisers. And also Kayla's photos traveled around the world in an exhibit by an organization called Positive Exposure. Rick Guadati runs that, and he was a former fashion photographer, but he started moving into taking photos of people with disabilities. And he does an incredible job of showing the person behind the disability. Just those experiences were really incredible. When Kayla was 8 years old, we were lucky enough to speak at a congressional hearing on Capitol Hill in support of the MD Care Act, which unanimously passed, which was very exciting. We were doing everything and anything we could do to advocate, telling her story everywhere and sharing videos and stories. I started a blog for her many, many years ago when she was about 3 days old, and it's cureforkayla.com. But in the past 5 years, I've been working more as an independent consultant, working alongside pharmaceutical companies, working on clinical trials for DM. I'm also a member of a CAB, which is a community advisory board through UPATI in Europe. So working with anybody who wants to focus on this disease. In fact, next week, we're preparing to speak with the FDA to see how we can move treatments forward for CDM. So we're very excited about that.
Is there some kind of, I don't say a double-edged sword, but because it's a disease that's maybe a bit lesser known, do you have to push harder for that, or is it easier to open doors because people want to be educated on it?
I think people want to be educated on it, but many people don't know it. I never heard the words myotonic dystrophy before we received a diagnosis. With that diagnosis came my diagnosis after Kayla and then my mother. So it is a family disease. But, I think right now there's no treatments for myotonic dystrophy. There's no currently FDA-approved treatment for DM. But there are medications that can help with some symptoms, such as myotonia or excessive daytime sleepiness, which is a huge issue. But there's really nothing that is going to make big enough changes that people can have a better quality of life.
You mentioned treatments, and obviously there isn't one, but with somebody that has this condition, what typically would the medical community do for them?
There are clinics all across the world for neuromuscular conditions. And so hopefully families live close enough to one to be able to access that. But I think one of the biggest challenges is people who live too far away and cannot get regular help. But doctors, continually measure improvements that are happening, speech. They can recommend therapies as the child grows, which is great. But it's really just symptom management of different symptoms with lots of different providers. So honestly, in the first year, we had Kayla home for part of that. We had 105 medical appointments. That included therapies. And so we were busy. And in between, we were working on trying to help her to work on all of those therapies, because one therapy session is not going to do it. You have to have a team of people, in your family that are willing to help and follow through on all those things.
Are there many companies that are working on developing treatments for this?
Yes. Back in 2007, when we first started the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation, we went to an international conference for researchers on myotonic dystrophy, and there was no session on therapies. Currently today, there's over 20 companies trying to address myotonic dystrophy. They're all at various phases of development with various approaches, including, investigation of therapeutic candidates such as titiglucid, which is a GSK3 inhibitor. I'll let Mike talk about that. There's antisense therapies like DYNE-101 and small molecules that correct RNA binding proteins. So there's lots of different ways to attack it. And I think it's very exciting that not everybody's trying the same thing, because we don't know what's going to work and we don't know what's going to be the most effective. And maybe it's a combination of things that will treat this disease. But with the complexity of it, having that many pharmaceuticals now involved is very exciting.
As Lisa mentions, Jim, there's a number of companies in the myotonic dystrophy space. If we, perhaps not entirely justifiably, but for the sake of conversation, divide myotonic dystrophy type 1 into the adult onset form and the congenital onset form, there are 2 companies currently in phase 3 for the adult onset form, and then a lot of earlier stage companies. But as far as I am aware, AMO Pharma is the only company presently focusing on the congenital onset form. I think most people have taken the view that they want to address the adult onset form first, and then maybe extend from whatever they can get done there into congenital children later on.
I have to say I appreciate that so much, because the congenital form is the most severe and the mortality rate is high. Families I know have lost kids, right at birth, stillbirths, all the way up until 30. And that's probably the oldest child I know with congenital. So we have a limited time frame. And so the work that AMO is doing with CDM is, the community is very grateful.
So what was your approach with the company to tackling this?
We're working on a molecule that was recommended to us by Professor Luba Timchenko at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. It's the molecule that was originally designed as a kinase inhibitor, but what we discovered once we'd started working on it is that it actually interacts directly with this junk RNA that Lisa mentioned at the beginning that causes the disorder. All forms of myotonic dystrophy are related to the strange expanded RNA that has a very specific sequence that interacts, gooping things up, I think Lisa described it as, within the nucleus in every cell in the body. And most of the agents that are being developed as therapies target and try to specifically initiate the degradation of that RNA. And that's what AMO02 does. It binds directly to the RNA, and once that binding has happened, it triggers the destruction of it and therefore addresses the underlying basis of the condition. And it's mixed up. It's a strawberry flavored liquid that you take by mouth, and once you've swallowed it, it distributes all around the body. So that's our therapeutic approach. And as Lisa mentioned, it's striking to us. It's not, of course, we want to branch out in the fullness of time to all aspects of myotonic dystrophy, but hearing the stories and seeing the affected families and individuals with the congenital onset form, straight away that became our priority.
Are you thinking that in the future this is something that will be tackled by a multitude of approaches?
I'm not sure necessarily, Jim. I think what most people are trying to do is to somehow address this, shall we call it, toxic RNA. And I think some of the approaches will work. Many of them look very promising, but I'm not sure that they're necessarily additive or complementary to each other. They're all trying to do the same thing. So it becomes a case of probably which one works best and is most convenient to take and gets to the relevant organs of the body and so on.
With your treatment, is it something that is just a one and done, or is it something that you need to keep taking?
No, you would need to keep taking it. This RNA is continuously produced, and so whatever therapeutic you use, you would need to keep removing it. And the only thing that differentiates different therapies is, do you take it every day or once a month or whatever, but it's always going to be an ongoing treatment, I think.
And what does it mean in terms of the disease for patients? Is it something that kind of stops it in its tracks, or is it management of the symptoms, or are you looking at eventually towards being able to cure this?
I'm always hesitant to use the word cure. That's a very loaded term and it can mean different things to different people. What we envisage is if the hypothesis underlying the mechanism of action that we postulate is correct, we should be able to remove the underlying biological cause of the disorder and therefore allow normal tissue function. And whether that means reversing some of the difficulties that people have or whether it means preventing them from progressing and getting even worse, I think we'll have to see how that plays out over time. What we're concerned with is we see signals, I wouldn't say definitively proven, but signals of efficacy where we do seem to reverse existing problems in the shorter term. And now we're beginning to wonder, after individuals have been receiving this investigational medicine for a long time, perhaps whether we should begin looking at some real world evidence outcomes, like how often people are ending up in hospital and so on, that kind of protection from events of those kinds. I think we're trying to do quite a lot of different things, Jim, with something, as are everyone working in the field. If you can have a disease modifying agent, presumably the benefits will be quite broad and could be assessed in a number of ways.
With a disease that's this complex, with so many body systems involved, for a caretaker, one, you have to learn everything you need to know to care for your child, plus, potentially yourself and the previous generation. And so you're caregiving in all of these different places with different levels, and it gets very complicated. So even if several symptoms were alleviated, I think that would make a huge world of difference. I mean, obviously, everybody wants this to be reversed completely and to move on with your life as in nothing ever happened. But the reality is, it's a complicated disease. And, I think that we just need to keep working and seeing how these drugs are affecting patients. So far we've seen some really interesting improvements. This drug with AMO happens to cross the blood-brain barrier so that it does affect brain issues. And that's, especially with children with this, that's a huge challenge. And so the fact that a child can go from, having more autistic-like features to being more social and being engaged with school and their friends, and just that one change would be amazing. So we're grateful for all the work that's being done. Helping patients is something that I'm incredibly passionate about. I'm one of those patients, although I'm still fairly mild. So, I really want to see, especially the children that are dealing with this at such a young age, get some of the help that will help them be able to have a much better quality of life.
And so where are you at on the clinical trial pathway?
We've initiated 3 studies to date. We did a small pilot study based here in the UK in adolescents and adults with a congenital childhood diagnosis. So people who'd got through the difficult early years and were perhaps in the more vulnerable age range in the mid-teens onwards. Again, that was really a pilot that showed us the directionality that we needed to consider. On the basis of that, we then ran a double-blind placebo-controlled trial where half of the individuals had placebo and half had the investigational medicine for a 5-month treatment period. That was the first ever study of an intervention in individuals with congenital myotonic dystrophy. And we looked at a variety of outcomes, and we managed to pick the one thing that was an imperfect measurement instrument. So we didn't hit on our primary, but on a range of other measures, we saw very clear signals of efficacy. The participants in that study were eligible, if they elected to then, we call it roll over into a 1-year open label extension study where everyone was guaranteed treatment for at least 12 months. And almost everyone did roll over into that study. At the end of that study, upon request, we elected to not finish at a year. And that study's now been running since the summer of 2021. So those participants have been gaining access to the medication continuously for over 4 years now. And what we've been doing recently, and we're not in a position to announce anything just at the moment, but looking at what's happening over the longer term. I mentioned earlier thinking about, real world evidence. Where do they get to in the course of their condition as they're entering the progressive stage? And that's an analysis we're working on right now. And Lisa mentioned we're having meetings with the regulators to think about that data and to think about a final study, the phase 3 level, to get a sort of definitive proof of safety and efficacy ahead of thinking about submitting for approval as a prescription medicine.
And what about the regulatory pathway? Where are you at on that?
We are, of course, the first people to try and tread the path for the congenital individuals, and it is complex. Because it is such a highly complex condition in the way it presents, selection of outcome measures isn't easy. It's involved a lot of discussion. I believe we're coming to the end of that process, and hopefully we'll be able to announce, the design of our last study fairly quickly. We're anxious to get going on a phase 3 study in individuals with the congenital form. And then, once that's underway and all completed, then move on to looking at the adult onset form, which theoretically should respond just the same way to treatment.
I was going to ask you about that in terms of the treatment. Does the stage at which a person is at with the disease or the early diagnosis, does that make a difference?
I think it depends on the outcome measure that you're trying to choose. I think what most people, researchers in the field, have done is looking at individuals who have become symptomatic and then attempting to either prevent their symptoms getting worse or indeed reverse the symptoms that they already have. And I think both things are achievable. So I'm not presently sure for at least the adult onset form, whether it's absolutely critical to get a very, very rapid diagnosis and initiate treatment very aggressively, very quickly, or you've missed the only window of opportunity. I think the window of opportunity, obviously it's better not to have someone progress too far, but the window of opportunity might be quite broad. And I think for the congenital individuals, again, trying to think of pragmatic trial designs, probably one might not start treatment, until into childhood rather than, neonatal situations. I would like to feel optimistic that we can intervene even once symptoms have become recognized.
And Lisa, what are your hopes? Are you optimistic too?
I am optimistic. I think the thing that's kept me going for the last 21 years is hope. It's a powerful thing. It's so exciting to see all of these companies investing in trying to find the treatments. The hope is for improving patients' quality of life and reducing the complexity of management of so many symptoms with multiple family members also. I think that you have to keep hope. We've come so far in this disease in the last 21 years that I've been involved in it. There's lots of tools for families. There's lots of things to help manage different areas of the symptoms and the issues that happen along the way. But now it's looking at the treatments, and I think you have to really keep hope high. It's definitely what kept me going, and it kept me going after I lost Kayla and my mother now. So, I just really want a better quality of life for all of these people that have become very close friends of mine.
It's one thing to kind of work with people that have this disease. Are you kind of looking at it on many different fronts in order to improve the chances for better treatments? I mean, clearly you've got to be working with companies and trying to encourage clinical trials. It's a very multifaceted approach, I guess.
It is, and it's incredibly important for the patient voice to be included as part of the development of pharmaceuticals, especially for a disease like this that's so complex and variable. Patients live day to day dealing with the complexities of this disease and at varying levels among different family members. Many caretakers are affected in caring for other family members, which is so incredibly challenging. So ensuring that the patient voice is always included, it'll give us a chance for better treatments options in the future. So we're going to keep things loud and make sure that we educate as many people as we can on myotonic dystrophy. And it really is. It's 1 in 2,100 prevalence. around the world. So it's actually much more common than it used to be thought. The prevalence used to be 1 in 8,000. So there are definitely a lot of people going around, the world with this disease that don't know it. Many people, we have a huge contingent of families that were in the military and were discharged. And it turns out later they were diagnosed with myotonic dystrophy, but they had no idea why they were suddenly not able to keep up with the others. And it definitely, with 1 in 2,100, as a prevalence, it is important to keep forward motion on all of these treatments because there are a lot of people still walking around like I was. In fact, I was a Division I collegiate athlete in college, played both basketball and volleyball. I'm quite tall. And I was really strong. I had no idea. So when we got this diagnosis, it just shook my world. I thought, how? How did I do that? But my symptoms definitely going to come later in life. I mean, I do have some now, but as my life progresses, I'll definitely be more affected. So it can happen to anybody. And it was quite a shock. I think, most people don't go having kids if they know they have it, or there's, other options to have IVF or other things to help have a healthy child. So there's lots of opportunities now for families to grow without having to pass this kind of a disease along.
And as a company, Mike, how important is the awareness and advocacy groups in getting these things pushed forward?
Beyond absolutely critical. I can't think of any way of saying it more strongly than that. I'd like to thank Lisa enormously for all the help she's given us, and also the other patient advocates that we work with. We have a little group with Lisa, representatives from the UK and from Canada. We meet every other week to go through things, and their collective help in making us aware of what we need to focus on is incredibly important. And also, Lisa's been there alongside us and the participants in our studies, helping the participants, because taking part in a clinical trial is difficult for anybody. Taking part in a clinical trial when it's your child is even harder. Taking part in a clinical trial when it's your child and you're affected by the same condition is just about as tough as it could possibly be. So Lisa's help providing support to those participants was critical in our studies. We wouldn't be here today, Jim, without Lisa and our other patient advocates. So absolutely critical, yeah.
And what are the next steps for the company? And do you have other things in the pipeline that you're working on?
This is our focus. So it's very much about final stages of negotiation and agreement with the regulatory agencies, and then moving on to phase 3, first in the congenital case and then later in the adult.
All right, I guess that's about it. But is there anything else that you wanted to add?
One thing, I kind of brought it up earlier, is that the FDA didn't always have patient advocates. So it's a new thing to be an advocate for a disease in the room when people are making decisions. I'm a member also of a community advisory board, which has become a huge part of trying to find treatments for diseases. It's an international board, and we work with any and everybody who wants to get our input and to make sure they get it right. It's very complicated to understand the day-to-day of this disease. So those patient advocates can really make a difference and give awareness of things that might not be thought of. So it's really been quite a moving thing to be a part of. I've been working, as a consultant for the last 5 years alongside AMO, and it's been an honor.
I think sometimes the patient side of these discussions gets lost, so it was great to feature that as well in the interview. Definitely makes it a much more real discussion than just considering how a drug works. Any time that you can make it more personal, it really leaves an impression. So that's it for this week's podcast. If you do want to get in touch with guest opportunities, or if you want to advertise, please feel free to contact us at jim@deeptechdigest.com. And this also gives me the occasional opportunity to mention that, unlike some other podcasts, we do not charge for the opportunity to be a guest. So until next time, wherever in the world you are, I hope you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Base to Base Biotech podcast. The Base to Base Biotech podcast is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.